and Mrs. Oliver is absent.
All right, we'll begin with the pledge.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, just to review the calendar of upcoming meetings and events, next week we have the organizational meeting with our regularly scheduled board meeting to follow immediately. Festivities begin at 6. December 21st, 2020 to January 8th of 2021 is winter break for students. December 23rd through 25th is also holiday with school sites and Sousa being closed. And December 31st to January 1st, it would be holiday time for school sites and Sousa being closed then as well. Item 3, public comments. We don't have any non-agenda or agenda public comments this evening, so we'll move on to approval of the agenda as presented.
I'll move to approve the agenda as presented.
I'll second.
Been moved by Mrs. Cordero and seconded by Mr. Lara that the agenda be approved as presented. So let's do roll call.
Mrs. Alvarez?
Aye.
Mr. Lara? Mrs. Cordero?
Aye.
Mr. Hollinshead?
Aye.
Mr. Lara needs to unmute.
I do when I speak. I just mute it so you don't hear me breathing.
I'm not buying that.
I'm not sleeping.
As we have closed session to follow, there won't be a report out on that, obviously. And it appears there's no consent agenda to approve. So onward and upward to the action items. 5A, certification of the first interim report for 2020-2021.
Mr. Hollinshead, this is an item that many times, as soon as it is brought up, I hand it over to Brian King to carry the presentation. Tonight, we're going to tag team a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I have that ability. And then Brian will start, and then I want to share some of the things that are very unique about this year. Some of it connected to COVID, some of it connected to other issues that are going to be on our minds here in the business office, and also needing to be in the minds of the school board as we go forward. And I can see that I can share. Hopefully you can see what I'm trying to share.
Yes, you're on.
Awesome. Let me make a quick change so I can see you all as well. All right, thank you. So with that, my job is now to make sure I flip slides when Brian needs me to. This is going to be Brian's portion. So Brian, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Matt. Good evening, board. Matt, you can go to the next slide. So for first interim, wanted to go over some of the assumptions we used to create the first interim budget. We had a decrease of enrollment of 254 students. That's from what we used at budget adoption to what we're now using at first interim. Our estimated total ADA for 2021 is 16,133, but our estimated funded ADA for this year is 16,377. That's a result of a hold harmless, COVID-related hold harmless that says we're going to use the ADA from last year for this year. So on the revenue side, LCFF revenue increased by 15.1 million. I did mention that during the 45-day budget revision back in August. That's the result of when we created the budget, adoption budget, we thought there would be budget cuts of 7.92%, but the budget the state adopted had a 0% COLA, so almost basically flat funding. At budget adoption, we didn't know what CARES dollars we're going to receive. The CARES dollars are for COVID-related expenditures and things like that. So the CARES dollars came in at $20.5 million. Those CARES dollars are put into basically 3 buckets. Each bucket has a certain timeline of when you have to spend those dollars. The biggest bucket of $18.2 million needs to be spent by December 30th, so another 21 days. Rebecca Herrick's office and myself have been tracking those dollars and doing a good job of spending those dollars. Another bucket of $1.6 million needs to be spent by June 30th of 2021. And then the last bucket of $720,000 needs to be spent by September of 2022. Also on the revenue side, we had an increase, a restricted revenue of $3.1 million. That's as a result of our carryover. So when we do create our adoption, we don't know what our restricted Title 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't know what the carryover is going to be. But at first interim, we do know now because we have closed last year. So the carryover is $3.1 million. And then our special education saw a nice increase in revenue of 1.7. $400,000 of that is kind of one-time dollars that is rolling over from last year. And the other piece is actually ongoing increase. Next slide, Matt. So when we look at the changes from adoption to first interim, that big change, that first line, LCFF revenue increased by the 15.1 million. As I talked about, we don't have a cut, we have 0% COLA. The federal revenue increased by 21 million. Other state revenue increased by 2.9 million. That's a result of budgeting those CARES dollars, that $20 million, and some of the restricted carryover now posted on the revenue side. Other local revenue increased by 1.4. That's a result of special education, additional dollars. So we have a total increase in revenue of 40.7 million. On the expenditure side, the certificated salaries, classified salaries, employee benefits, that's a tightening of the budget now. Some aides weren't hired. Also during this COVID time, some subs and extra time decreased. We didn't have the need for that. The books and supplies, increase of 16.7 million. Services and other operating expenditures, increase of 7.9 million. Those are big increases, but that's the result of budgeting those $20 million of CARES dollars and budgeting the restricted carryover dollars. Also, capital outlay increased by 880,000. That's as a result of budgeting CARES dollars for equipment of basically an item that expenditures over $5,000. And then lastly, transfer to restricted funds, line 11 there, increased by 3.4 million. That's a result of moving the certificate of participation payments back into the general fund. This has always been a general fund expenditure, but at budget adoption with the cut, we moved that expenditure out to a different fund, to Fund 25, which is where our developer fees go in. But now with first interim, and we have a little higher revenue compared to adoption, we moved that expenditure back into Fund 01 where it has always been. Next slide, Matt. So looking at our multi-year assumptions, as I mentioned, adoption had a cut. Now first interim, 0% COLA, and we have 0% COLA for the next 2 out years. Estimated change in enrollment since adoption, our estimate went down by 1.5%. Our regular ADA, so regular ADA is before additional, before we count the ADA from our county operated programs. So the regular ADA at adoption was 16,312. Now it's been revised for first interim for 16,092. And the next line is the funded regular ADA. So you'll see for this year, we're getting funded on off 16,335, which is our 1920 ADA. We also are going to get funded at that same rate for 21-22. So then in 22-23, you'll see regular funded ADA of 16,092. That's when we take the hit for our low enrollment, is in 22-23. With our multi-year assumptions, we also remove one-time revenues and expenditures, and restricted programs are balanced, and we do charge indirect when allowed. So looking at our multi-year, so for this year, we have deficit spending of $4.2 million. In 21-22, it increases to $8.9 million, and then 22-23 increases to $14 million. In 21-22, for federal and state revenues, you'll see a nice decline. That's a result of we have those one-time CARES dollars this year, but we don't have them next year, so we have to take those out of the multi-year, and also take it out on the expenditure lines too, like for books and supplies, services, and other operating expenditures. That's why we have some budget reductions there, is because we're not budgeting those dollars in 21-22. When looking at 22-23, the LCFF revenue line, revenue of 185.2, you'll see that's down from the previous year of 188 million, down by over $2.8 million. So that's the result of that lower enrollment and in turn lower ADA. And that's when we get hit, is in 22-23. Going down the bottom in the red there, we have almost $42 million of deferrals for this year. And then I put question marks out for the next 2 years because we don't know right now. So lastly, next slide, Matt. And lastly is our fund balance in excess of minimum reserve requirements. We have to bring this to the board at adoption in every interim. Basically says, if you have an ending fund balance over your 3% reserve requirement, you have to stay what that dollar amount is, and then you have to state why you have over a 3% reserve requirement. So for 2021, we need to substantiate 42.5 million, 21-22 substantiate 34.9, and then 22-23 substantiate 22.5. Down below is the reasons, our substantiation, our reasons why. We have a set aside for deficit spending in 21-22 prior to identifying budget reductions, a set aside for deficit spending in 22-23 prior to identifying budget reductions. We have a set aside for the math adoption, set aside for future curriculum and textbook adoptions, and then a set aside for board policy 3100, which basically states that the board intends to maintain a minimum assigned and unassigned fund balance in an amount the board deems sufficient to maintain physical solvency and stability and protect the district against unforeseen circumstances. So we're using 10% for that. And with that, I can answer any questions. If not, then I'll turn it over to Matt.
Brian, I got a quick question. In 22-23, you're saying our ADA is forecasted at 16,092.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. What was the question again?
For 22-23 school year, our ADA is 16,092 is what's being forecast.
16,092. That is our that is going to be our regular fund. That's our funded regular ADA.
Okay. All right.
But it's not our projected ADA for attendance.
That's what I was going to be. That was going to be my next question. So that's not the
attendance for. That's what we're projecting our attendance to be for this year.
Uh-huh.
The COVID like extra year of safe harbor, we have 2 years of ADA. 2019-20 and 2020-21 will have the same ADA amount, and then that following year 22-23 is when we'll take that hit and have that revenue limit reduction.
Okay, yeah, that's. I just wanted to make sure that's what I was getting at.
So
right.
As far as our budget assumptions, we still practice a flat enrollment at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And is that correct? Or did we adjust for the projected ADA decline in that out year, Brian?
We projected for a decline for this year, and then it's flat funding for the next few years.
Okay.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, Linda.
Do we have any information regarding why we have that decline in enrollment? Is it strictly based on projections from birth rates and what we normally use, or has it been affected by COVID?
Yes and yes. And actually, I'm really glad you asked that question because it does lead into a portion of the conversation I want to carry in this second portion of our presentation tonight. So if I don't get an answer that you feel like addresses that question, please ask it again to make sure that we get you the information you need. But I think I might be able to get you some form of an answer. Other questions on the first couple slides before we move on?
Hey Matt, it may seem out there, but there's the 16 million that's set aside for books and supplies. Is there something identified for all? Because that's a big number. Is there something already identified for that?
So in this chart, if you're talking about along the bottom line there, the 17 million, the 16 million, and the 16.6 million.
No, I mean, maybe that's the same one, but it was a couple of slides ago.
So Brian does have a set aside, or there's a set aside on this sheet for $4.4 million for the, or you're talking about the actual budget sheet, is that
I'm
right?
not talking about the actual budget sheet back about a few where it said 16 million for books and supplies.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big jump from what we had at the previous budget.
Yeah, so that reduction from 33.8 million to 17.2, this year we are budgeting, off the top of my head, somewhere between $18 million for books and supplies for those CARES dollars that we have to spend.
Right.
And a lot of it's for distant learning. And so we're spending them in 2021. And so we don't have that revenue or those expenditures in 21, 22. So
right.
That's why there's a big drop there.
And that's what I was asking, was what that 16 million from the CARES was if it had been something had been identified, because it seemed like that was a big breakout from the total.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of
I was wondering if there's something specific one time that we were spending it on.
Those CARES dollars.
Yeah.
So a lot of that, and Rebecca is truly the expert, or probably at least closer to the details than I am. In general, we spent a great deal of those resources on remote learning supplies for students, remote instruction supplies for teachers, and then PPE and disinfectant supplies and antibacterial products and the like. But Rebecca can probably, I don't want to put you on the spot because this isn't your presentation, but I think that you've watched a lot of those CARES dollars go through the process, and you may be able to give a little more detail than what I provided in a response.
Sure, I would be happy to. A lot of them funding also went towards technology to make sure that all students had Chrome notebooks, and also to our wireless and to the infrastructure of technology. A big portion went to technology. Also a lot of extra time for staff members that were doing different work and extra work. And some of the things that were included, even in the student supplies, were books for our students. We just put in a second order so that they would each have 5 books in the spring again that they could actually have at home. And then a lot, some were with the maintenance and operation department as well, ensuring that they had all that they needed to make sure everyone was safe and our campuses were where they needed to be during this time.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So a lot of times when we get ready to share the first interim and really any budget report with the school board, try and focus on the changes from the last time we talked about the budget to where we have our current stance. And that's kind of the part that Brian's shared so far. And then generally the last slide or two is kind of a look ahead, the kinds of things that are on Brian and my radar as we're getting ready to prepare for the next year budget. As you all know, the unprecedented use of the word unprecedented over the last 9 months, it requires, or it indicates to me that I need to spend a little more time on what we're doing looking ahead. So I want to spend the next couple slides going through probably the 3 biggest things that are on our horizon. The declining enrollment question, Ms. Cordero, that you asked, is a really big question for us. We've been talking about it for a couple of years. It's been kind of showing itself within our trends. So I want to spend a little time on that. Many of you have heard that the Legislative Analyst's Office described a windfall for this year in their projections. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. And then we have talked on a few occasions about AB 1835, a bill by Dr. Weber out of the San Diego area that had prescribed a process where districts would have to identify unspent supplemental and concentration grant dollars and then set them aside for specific use to serve unduplicated pupils. And so I want to walk through these 3 topics because they have significant impacts on the way we will be preparing our projections and our financial plans for next year. So declining enrollment. There are a few headlines out there that many districts across the nation are experiencing a decline in enrollment. And the fact is that students exist. That I attended a national webinar roundtable on enrollment projections, and experts on all coasts and in the middle of the country are all describing, we know our models that project how many students should be in school are tried and true. And if they said these number of students would be here and they're not, these students are somewhere, right? They are somewhere. But they're not necessarily enrolling in public schools. And so I wanted to share just some headlines because we're not the only district that's experiencing the decline in enrollment that we experienced this year, as Brian described, almost 300 students. This was a slide I obtained from FM3 Research. It was in one of the workshops that I attended. It kind of provides a breakdown of where we're parents' responses to the question, are you considering moving your children from public school to a private school or parochial school or charter school as a result of pandemic-related issues? And so, as far as weighing public sentiment, almost 25% of parents said, yeah, that's something they're considering. And so that is out there. And it is real, and I think it is having an impact on some numbers and potentially our numbers. So I wanted to share that information because I think that responds directly to the questions you must have in your minds about the impact of COVID on our enrollment. But for us, inside our fundamentals, this is our birth rate chart. So this is how many births have been occurring in 2009, the front half of that quotient, 2010, 2011, 2012, and so on. And the reason it's numbered that way is the other half of that is what is 5 years later, what is their kindergarten enrollment year? So in 2009, it would be 2014. That's the way I've set the charts up. So this is enrollment in kindergarten 5 years later. So as those births have declined over time, so has kindergarten enrollment each year or each 5th year after that. So while there may be an influence of the pandemic on our enrollment today, there is also just a structural decline in our enrollment caused by this decrease in the birth rate. I don't have the chart for you tonight that combines these and shows the student generation rate, which is the percentage of students who show on campus 5 years later in our zip code from those births. It has been in the 70s, generally in the low 70s, upper 60s. And recently we've been seeing numbers in the 67th and 66th percentage of those students. So even that number is starting to decline a little bit. But these two charts depicted the message, which is inherent within our population is a decline in enrollment, not just pandemic related. So the way that plays out in our own projected enrollment is the largest decline being this year when that decline in kindergarten enrollment hits. Most of that is in TK, most of that is in kindergarten. And then you can see that we are projecting for flat enrollment in the out years, which is better than declining enrollment, right? Some of that is brought off of the new construction that is slowing but still active in our area. But the fact is births generate students, not buildings, right? So even though we are building buildings, that may not necessarily result in new students, but it's still a factor we use to come up with what our estimates are. But what the main message from this slide is at the bottom there, projections do not show a recovery of that lost enrollment. Now it's possible, I'm wondering, you know, how close our first grade number is going to be, with kindergarten being a non-mandatory grade. If I have families who are keeping their kindergartners at home and pursuing a different venue for their education and development as a kindergarten age student, and we have a bigger jump in first grade next year, and we'll have to see how that works, right? We'll have to see how that results when students come, right, or when they enroll for next year, right? Brian already covered this part as far as essentially having a 2-year safe harbor, but that reduction in revenue that comes when that reduced ADA amount actually comes into our revenue calculations will be about $2.8 million in lost ongoing revenue. So obviously with a dollar amount of that size, and then just the implications of declining enrollment, that's a big item on our watch list for the coming years. So again, I wanted to also touch on the LAO's windfall report. You know, even school services said that the numbers were rosy from the LAO, and generally school services is super conservative and they won't use words like that, but that was the LAO's report and that was their conclusion. I want to share a little bit of the detail behind that just to make sure we understand what they mean. This is kind of a simple picture that describes the Budget Act assumptions for what was adopted for tax revenues and then the actual collections. And so essentially what it appears to me as a layman is that the governor and the legislature worked out a budget that they could agree on that implemented the economy as it was known between March the 18th and May the 10th, right? When we were in a very restricted shelter in place. And since that time, the arms of business have been opening up more and more, and there's been a lot more activity. And along with the protections that are in place, the economy has started again, and that's what's generating, and that's, I'm sure, why that gap is widening. That's what's generating those additional collections above those estimates in the original Budget Act assumptions. Notes that were in the presentation that the deputy in charge of the Education Division shared with us at the CBO Symposium was that the employment in the leisure and hospitality sectors are 1/3 lower than pre-pandemic levels. So they've been hit and they remain on the downside still, high unemployment for obvious reasons. They're in a face-to-face business, they're in a high-touch business, and it's not necessarily essential work, right? So their functions have been impacted significantly. September 2020 unemployment rate was 11%, which was comparable to the Great Recession, but certainly a lot less than the original projections and what we experienced early in March. That number actually, the day of the symposium, that Thursday, was actually reduced to 9.3%. So it's even better than that. I wanted to make a note of that. Another thing that's creating this windfall is the caseload for Medi-Cal, CalFresh, and CalWorks are below Budget Act projections. So they expected to have to provide more assistance than they're actually experiencing. So along with having additional collections, they're having lower expenses in this area. And again, they ended with preliminary data for 2020-21 does not suggest a major upturn. So while they're talking about windfall, it's coming from a change in their estimates, a change in their projections, not necessarily a fundamental change in the economy. So these are just some of the headlines that came with that. This is a picture that shows that windfall in 21-22. There's a discussion right now in the 2021 school year, 2021 budget year, of this windfall. And what are the implications of that on our budget there next year, right? That's the projected windfall is for next year. Right now, the discussion isn't necessarily about changing the adopted budget at the state level and changing funding for schools. It's a projection for next year. And then, like I mentioned, without a structural change in the economy, you still see operating deficits for the state in the out years, growing to about 17 billion in 2024-25. So while there is a windfall that is good for this year, it isn't something that right now the LAO is projecting to sustain and continue in each subsequent fiscal year. So I was really pleased with the recommendations that the LAO was providing to legislators in Sacramento. Very reasonable, I would say, using half of the windfall for restoring budget resilience. And Mr. Cabral translated that, he's the deputy director in charge of the education division, as a restoration of some form of the deferrals. The use of another half for pandemic related needs. And then the really important one, which is begin a multi-year effort to address that ongoing deficit right now, right? Begin that work right now, because that's hard work. So I wanted to make sure, I believe this is my last slide on the LAO report. I wanted to make sure and give you this background. So as you hear and talk about the windfall, you have an understanding of its short-term nature, and that there are still things that we'll need to address coming out of the state budget in future years. Oh, I do have one more slide. So Mike Fine followed the presentation from the LAO, and his advice to school districts on preparing their budgets was, don't be distracted by the higher than projected tax receipts year to date. Many unknowns lie ahead regarding state revenues and state expenditures. It's November. Much too early to really know, because that's the thing, we don't know, these are just projections, right? It's too early to really know, but it's not too early to plan. And then it's great to have the confidence of the CEO of the Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team when he says, no matter what economic and out-year budget assumptions you make, you will likely be 100% wrong. So I know that every year we bring to you the first interim, the second interim, and an adopted budget, and the assumptions we use are 100% wrong, but at the same time, they're completely correct, right? The best information we have available to us, we use to create a conservative fiscal plan that allows us to stay on track each year and each year in succession. Oh, I put it in there twice. It was so important. My apologies I'm having a hard time leaving that slide. Okay. So the final section I want to talk about, we've talked about before, an update on the AB 1835 Weber bill. I did provide an update to the school board earlier on this topic that here's the structure of the bill. I kind of described its nature earlier. This was the bill summary. The governor vetoed that bill in September. I think that was the last update I provided to the board. But I wanted to highlight again some of the items in his veto message. So I'm returning Assembly Bill 1835 without my signature. I deeply support the underlying goal of this bill. And then there's a simpler solution that allows us to address these objectives. And that he looks forward to working with Dr. Weber and the legislature to implement this requirement as part of next year's budget. And the reason that's important is that that makes me expect that when we go to the governor's budget proposal webinar on January 15th, that we're going to hear what that looks like, that portions of the time that have passed since this date, this letter, the governor and his Department of Finance have been working through the mechanics of how to implement the intent behind this bill that he vetoed. Now, having shared all that language about the bill, I want to share also kind of the fiscal implications that we'll need to evaluate when we see the language. So this can be as impactful as any potential funding reductions that come from the COVID-19 connected downturn, except that the COVID connected economic downturn will be temporary and any other economic circumstances are going to be cyclical. When this finds its way into our business process, it's more likely to be long lasting or permanent. And the reason I say long lasting is LCFF isn't that old, right? Revenue limits, for that matter, aren't that old. They certainly aren't older than public education. If you remember revenue limits, the predecessor to LCFF. So I want to share with you the history of supplemental and concentration grant dollars. Excuse my abbreviations, but this has been by fiscal year the amounts that we've received across here in supplemental and concentration grant dollars, the amount that we've spent on increased and improved services for students, and the amounts that we've saved each year. And while the dollar amounts are big, I do notice that we have been doing a better and better job of completing our spending on those resources, but that it is not easy to spend $50 million wisely, given a short time frame to plan for that, right? Where we're trying to spend money in a way that improves services, not just spend money on more expensive services, right? To summarize those dollar amounts, we've received $232 million, spent about 178, leaving behind about 23.37%. Now, the reason this is significant, and the reason I bring it up on each occasion where I can, is that in our unaudited actuals, our unspent supplemental and concentration grant resources, I've repeated here, 54 million. Our total balance in unrestricted funds in the unaudited actuals as of 2019-20 is 53 million, which means outside of supplemental and concentration grant dollars that are unspent, there are $1 million in other unrestricted resources, which means we fully expended our base dollars, we fully expended our mandate dollars we've received, we fully expended our lottery dollars. All of those resources have been spent except for this dollar amount. Now, I say that based on the size of those unspent funds. But in essence, what this means is that our unrestricted general fund, the 0000, is people who have looked at a purchase order or a budget code before. The 0000 resource essentially is a negative number, right? We haven't accounted for it that way, but it reads to me like the governor's plan is to make that happen with the budget, right? This incoming budget will be to require us to account for those dollars separately as if they're restricted funds. So I shared that first bullet just now, but the main thing to describe is in that third bullet. If the rules that govern the use of unspent supplemental and concentration grant dollars that prevent them from being spent for any being available for any purpose the next year, which has been the current rules, the balance of spending will need to be shifted and the spending in the base grant dollars will need to be reduced. Both of those things are going to need to be going to need to occur. And that's a pretty big topic. This is probably the larger concern I have right now, just from the standpoint of, as you saw earlier, our unspent funds in 1920 were about $9 million, right, in supplemental and concentration grant funds. So there's going to be a lot of work in reducing that base spending or in shifting dollars around in a way that we can justify and support. So to try and wrap this up in 3 simple bullets based on each of the topics I shared, the LAO described a windfall in their financial outlook, just a projection, that is mostly made of one-time savings and significant structural deficits return and will need to be addressed by state leaders. Enrollment declines, particularly in TK and Kinder. They have hit SMBSD and many other districts across the nations. The fiscal implications are a little more than a year away. And then accountability changes connected to the local control accountability plan may have a significant impact on the resources and the resources used for base activities, excuse me. So with that, I believe, whoa. That I've finished with what I prepared to share with the board, and I want to make sure that I have a chance to answer any questions you have about the first interim or these 3 major topics.
Mrs. Flores or Mrs. Cordero?
So I think I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but base grant funding supports every teacher. Clarify that.
Sure.
Because if we have to shift those monies, I get how that could have a very negative effect on our overall program, I think. Sure.
So a response that I've heard from that question from Mel Kubinek, who some of us know from her time at School Services or West Ed, and I believe she's in another education agency right now as an advocate consultant. I don't have the name in my mind anymore, but her response was, the base dollars are, what do you know that you need when you first open school? That is your base. It's what you learn on day 2 and 3 and 4 that becomes supplemental. You identify this group of students that need these services. You identify this activity that requires a specialist. You identify these needs that require this additional service. But that first day, so to simplify, would be like principal, custodian, teacher, right? The office manager. And then after that, you may learn that you need translation services, or you might need special education comes with its own funding source, but you'll then identify those students and say, we need to provide these additional services. It's those subsequent days that aren't just about opening school and having it available for who comes through the door. It's addressing the needs that then come through the door.
Thank you.
She was way more succinct, but I wanted to provide that additional information because I've thought about it since then. I want to make sure that we're on the same page, and then I can hear feedback you have on that perception.
Nothing? Rita?
I'm good. I just, when it comes to money, that's where you really kind of start to see the squeezing of that dollar having to go further. Matt, did it cost us a heck of a lot more to do distance learning in a general statement?
In a general statement, you'd have to define heck, but I'm going to say yes, because of all the media, everything in the middle that Rebecca and I described that you had to put in place as far as getting Chromebooks deployed and the extra time it took to make that happen. Getting books into the hand of students at the beginning of the year and now halfway through the year, so that they have access to those materials at their home. And then the broadband access and hotspots, and then to be replaced by LTE that the district puts out on antenna. All those are additional costs that come with distance learning. Yes, there was certainly a need for more resources to deliver distance learning, for sure. So that I would have to answer that question with all of those words, and also end with yes, it does cost more.
Thank you.
I will also say there are services that cost less, right? And that's part of what went into this budget. So generally, I described our budget process has been to project flat enrollment. This year we have some conservative decline in there, and then budget for structurally a similar program the next year. And in our growing district, back when we were a growing district, we would always just move things forward because we knew those increasing expenditures were out there. In a declining enrollment district, we need to take a different approach, and facing the fiscal implications of the downturn in the economy, which will be buffered a little bit by this windfall. The other thing we're doing is trying to scour our current budget at each interim so that we have as much fund balance as we can expect. So Brian went through, and the big reason I want to share this with you, and identified as one, transportation. We haven't had to pay much more than maybe $9,000 a month in transportation because there's so little of it right now. Normally, we'd be heading towards a $5 million, $6 million transportation bill. And right now we're at, $70,000 maybe. So from that standpoint, I guess I'm making the argument that no, it doesn't cost more, but it's because you're making a trade, right? You're making a trade, but it requires an additional investment.
Yeah, it's a different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
With that, I hesitate, sorry to go back to the 16 million, but when we're talking about books and supplies and services, part of the CARES stuff is I think it's supposed to be for mitigation of learning loss. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or do we have any funds budgeted for extending the learning year or doing things to mitigate those losses yet, or has that been a discussion?
Right now, I can tell you we don't have anything in the budget for extending the school year. If there are those conversations, I don't know that I've been a part of them, but I know that isn't in the budget today to add school days.
Well, I guess I don't mean like actual school year for everybody. I mean extended like opportunities for like the summer school we've done, or any of the stuff that Rob's been doing, those kinds of things to kind of mitigate learning loss.
So, and this may be an area for Melissa to chime in.
Yeah. So one of the things, good evening, board members. So one of the things is exactly what Mr. Burton talked to you about at the last board meeting, was like a tutor.com. So that will be funded through the CARES funding. And that's something that absolutely is going to be helping with the mitigation of learning loss as we move forward this year. And then we also have all of the things that we've purchased for kids as well, with supplies and books and things like that, that will support that. And we're still in the planning phases for what summer will look like. What's difficult at this point, which I'm sure you can imagine, is, are we still in distance learning? Are we face to face? When we're thinking about planning out what June looks like, that's a little tough right now. And so we're having to really think through multiple scenarios like everything else. And so it's definitely on our radar that we'll need to continue to do that. We just don't know what the models will look like right now, just because we don't know what the model of schooling will look like when June comes around.
Gotcha. Thanks, Melissa. And then Matt, the other thing about like having as the reserve, I think I called you today and left a message, but one of the things that I heard discussed when we were at the CSBA sessions last weekend was John Gray and school services and some folks talking about establishing 115 trusts for not just for OPEB, but also even for STRS and PERS, and regardless of whether you really funded them robustly right now, but having that be the start of a process rather than going year to year like a lot of districts have been doing, to consider that with the possibility of the economy not recovering real quickly and still having to set aside those reserves. Did you guys hear anything about that at the conference or what have you that you're talking about?
I didn't hear that at the CBO symposium, but that's certainly an option to evaluate. I've thought about anyways, and have carried conversations with past superintendents about the OPEB reserve that falls under that, and the concern there being the permanent nature of those trusts. And so weighing the ability to have flexible access to those same resources versus making sure to set them aside. But that's certainly an option to look into. And there's no doubt that pension costs are going to continue to increase. And if there's a way to smooth that is wise and prudent, what you're describing sounds that way, it's certainly worth an evaluation.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And if I could just add to that, it exacerbates the description that Matt described around this restructuring that Governor Newsom's talking about the LCFF funding, because within that model, right, those irrevocable trusts become part of that resource. How do you identify that as a core or supplemental concentration? So it's kind of a bigger variable in terms of putting all pieces into that budgeting process.
Well,
I think what they were suggesting
was that because it was irrevocable, it was only for the one thing that yeah, you can see money there, but that's it. It can't be used for anything else, right, unless you draw it out for that one specific thing. Right. And that was why you would begin the trust, but maybe not like massively fund it or anything, or use whatever, a lot of the reserve or anything, but you would have that to, if you can forecast or foresee and didn't have, say, early retirements or some of the other options on the board, that you would have that to kind of begin to establish the process, so that it wouldn't hit you so hard when you could see some of those things.
Right. Coming up. So it's an evaluation of all those elements at one time. Yeah. That just gets squeezed tighter by what Matt was just describing.
Okay.
Are we
Well,
ready
thank you.
for a motion?
Thank you, team. Let's move.
I will make a motion to approve the interim budget as presented.
I, s-
Did you second it, Vita?
if I could just get my finger to work, yes.
Yeah. Been moved by Mrs. Cordero, seconded by Mrs. Flores, that the board issue a positive certification of the 2020-2021 first interim report and certify to the Santa Barbara County Superintendent of Schools that Santa Maria Bonita School District will be able to meet its financial obligations for the 2020, 2021, 2021, 22, and 2022, 23 fiscal years as presented. Roll call.
Mrs. Alvarez,
Aye.
Mr. Lara,
Aye.
Mrs. Cordero,
Aye.
Mr. Hollinshead.
Aye. The motion passes, and we'll move on to item 5B, adoption of local control funding formula budget overview for parents. And I believe that's Ms.
I'll get it started. Thank you so much. Just as we get started on this item, I wanted to take a moment to really thank the partnership between the Department of Plan Alignment and our business department. Their diligence and hard work in putting together tonight's presentations is greatly appreciated. And with that, I will hand it over to our Director of Plan Alignment, Rebecca Herrick.
Thank you, Ms. Dutra, and good evening, board members again, and Mr. Ontiveros, cabinet members, and all of our stakeholders who are watching this evening. As Ms. Dutra shared, I will be reviewing the LCFF budget overview for parents this evening. The budget overview for parents is included in our district plan and alignment cycle. In California, Ed Code requires school district to develop this budget for parents, and the LCFF budget overview aligns with the LCAP plan from the 2019-20 school year and the learning continuity plan from this year. As a reminder, the learning continuity and attendance plan took the place of the LCAP plan. Senate Bill 98 changed the required adoption date for the overview from June 2020 till December 15th, 2020, in conjunction with the first interim budget report. And the budget overview was created for parents in order to provide transparency to stakeholders. A very rough draft of the overview was shared at the first LCAP meeting at the last one. And a second rough draft, which included further budget details, was shared at our last DLAC meeting on December 2nd. Our DLAC members were able to ask questions and provide valuable input concerning the written portion of the budget overview and how we needed to ensure that it was understood by all stakeholders. This is what the budget overview looks like. It comes in a very kind of difficult format to upload. If we were in person, whoops, I'm sorry about that. Let me go back. I moved too quickly on that.
That's the one that got sent to us. So
Correct.
I have that one on my phone right now.
Perfect. And if we were in person, I would hand it out to our audience members. So this is kind of what I'm going to go through. This year, the format changed in order to align with state and federal budgets to include the federal CARES funds. There are three parts to the budget overview for parents. The first section includes the total revenue for the 2021 school year, all state funds, local funds, federal funds, including title funds, and again, the CARES ESSER funds. The second section of the budget is the expenditures. The section includes what is planned for the general fund and outlined in learning continuity and attendance plan, and the funds for high need students. The final section includes the LCFF expenditures. Again, we go back to 1920 school year. These expenditures were in the LCAP And we have to look at the actual expenditures compared to what was planned. And this is kind of what we were just talking about. So in the overview, we provide information pertaining to additional actions that we are taking to increase or improve services for our high needs students. Some of these actions and services were not directly called out in the learning continuity and attendance plan, but they are aligned with our prior year LCAP actions and services, and most importantly, with our district goals. They include additional professional learning, specifically to high quality first instruction and distance learning. They include our instructional coaches. We have one coach at every elementary site and one English learner coach at every school, including junior highs. They include our teachers on special assignments, our elementary PE teachers, 2 per site, additional band teachers for our elementary level. They include our virtual summer school that took place in July 2020. They include our assistant principals, our deans, our junior high counselors, and our school site supplemental concentration allocations that are outlined in our school plans. The last part of the overview, and what I want to bring to your attention in this section, is it reviews the total budget expenditures for our high needs students. Basically, our plans for the 1920 school year versus what actually happened. We want to be transparent to our stakeholders and provide an explanation for the differences. You will see this again in our LCAP in the annual update for next year. And the ones I'm highlighting this evening had the biggest impact on our planned expenditures. So first, many actions and services were dependent on personnel. We were able to hire 77% of positions, and some were filled later in the year. So a good example is our primary grade bilingual instructional aides. Not all of them were hired at the beginning of the year, and there were some vacant positions throughout the year. The second one is that CARES ESSER funds were used to increase integrated pupil supports to address social, emotional, and academic barriers. We did talk about some of those this evening, about technology and some of the supplies that were given out. So the other one, because of the actual building closure in March through the end of the year, there were several changes made. So these are some examples. For professional learning, staff members were unable to attend the conferences. They did attend them via Zoom, which meant we did not have to cover the hotel and travel expenses. For expanded learning, March until June, not as many opportunities were available due to the focus on delivering instruction in a new format during the school day. Field trips were postponed, and in-person parent engagement and education was changed, most being postponed, and some schools started engaging their parents immediately on Zoom. We also had a substitute and extra time decrease, which Mr. King talked about earlier. And this in turn affects our staff attending conferences, some of the leadership meetings, and so forth. So remember, this is actually what happened in the 1920 school year. So our next steps are the school board adoption of the LCFF budget overview for parents. The LCFF budget overview for parents will be posted on the district website. We'll be starting our LCAP surveys coming up in January and February. DLAC and School Site Council ELAC meetings will continue. And then our next LCAP stakeholder meeting is not until March 24th. So we really need to take a look at that date because that's really further, that's quite a ways out from now. So that's all I have to share. A lot of it, you know, they went over earlier. So if you have any questions for me at this time.
Rebecca, this is John. What was the impact of not being able to and I don't mean like monetarily or budget wise, but necessarily, but what was the impact of not being able to secure some of the personnel? I mean, if we were had that big of a differential, were there programs that then were not fully implemented, or how did that affect that?
I can answer to that, Rebecca, if you'd like.
Yes, thank you.
We fly positions like for bilingual and bicultural instructional assistants and other assistants, and it is difficult to fill those positions at all times. We are looking for the right people, and we are constantly recruiting for those positions. So if we're talking about 1920, that's why we had vacancies still prior to March 13th. And then when we went under the shelter in place order, we did not continue recruiting at that time, as there really wasn't a direction as to services.
Thanks, Bijou. I guess it was I just, I think this is something that's happened ever since we started LCAP, right? Is you and even as the process has become more refined in trying to set goals for LCFF funds spending, is trying to see where they're going to be best utilized and hiring personnel.
We've expanded.
There's always things that go unfilled, but I just was curious about like how that affected, if that affected certain programs. But it sounds like a more broad thing from what you're saying, maybe.
So what we did for 2021, and Rebecca can concur, is we identified where we wanted to focus those services the most, which was kindergarten, first and second grade. And we've done a really good job of filling those vacancies. And yet then we have individuals who go on to further their education, and they need to leave us because they're going to school, but they stay on as substitutes. And we've actually really worked with providing flexibility to see if we can make it work with their schedule, as opposed to having them leave us. So, and we've also identified, just so you're aware, other areas for recruitment, such as using Indeed, as well as EdJoin. And we've also been creating stronger partnerships with Cal Poly and Hancock and other agencies so that we're able to get individuals that are working on becoming teachers and then giving them the opportunity to work in an instructional assistant role. But we're always looking for people.
Yeah, I know, and the more we talk about equity, like what we were hearing at our last conference and stuff, and the more we talk about trying to narrow that equity gap and what have you, a lot of stuff that comes out with our EL folks or EL kids is bilingual instruction or bilingual instructors, and it sounds like it's really hard to find those guys right now.
It's always been a challenge, but we are also working, I would say, with the Santa Maria Joint Union High School District to identify high school students that will then also look into engaging in this work as they proceed down the road of furthering their education.
And Ms. Beltran, we also just received a grant with Cal Poly that focuses on the building of bilingual and special education teachers. So that's really great opportunity for us to be able to have some really great hires from that as well.
Thank you guys so much, because I that when we do hear some of these presentations, the numbers on some of those other districts make it, I think, a little bit more straightforward or easier for them to address, because they're talking about doing these profound things with numbers of English learners that aren't anywhere close to what our student population is. And so I know that you guys are doing as much as you can to really kind of fulfill that need. So I appreciate that and moving forward.
Thank you. And just know that we reach out constantly to create more partnerships for that purpose, because it's for our community. So thank you for your questions and support.
Anybody else? Bueller? Anybody got a motion? Want to move?
I'll make the motion that the Board of Education adopt the local control funding formula, LCFF, budget overview for parents as presented.
I second.
Been moved by Mr. Lar and seconded by Ms. Flores that the board adopt the local control funding formula, LCFF budget overview for parents as presented. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Alvarez,
Aye.
Mr. Lara,
Aye.
Mrs. Cordero,
Aye.
Mr. Hollinshead.
Aye. Motion passes. Alrighty then. Does anybody have a board or superintendent report to make? Does anybody ever said Darth Vita before? Have they said that to you, Mrs. Flores?
No.
I saw you on mute. Do you have something to share? Mrs. Cordero, you're unmuted. Are you wanting to share?
No.
I'm good as well, Mr.
Yeah, I just have a couple of comments. I'd like to echo Melissa's comments and thank Rebecca and Brian for their partnership on this work. They do a really great job of particularly in this environment of navigating through the flexibility that is more profound every day. Want to thank the board for their attendance at CSBA conference last week, including Mr. Valencia. And Mr. Valencia, we're looking forward to next week of officially swearing you in and getting you here at the board table, whether virtual or literal, but really looking forward and appreciate your willingness to jump ahead. Mr. Valencia has finished the Masters in Governance program, attended the CSBA conference, just really excited to have his contributions as part of our governance team as we move forward. And then, can't not mention the developments in the COVID situation over the last week. The daily case rates in Santa Maria today, as reported on the county dashboard, we're at 25.7 daily cases per 100,000 population, and apparently growing. So back to Melissa's, John, your question about, how are we thinking about doing these things going forward? Ms. Dutra and her team has been working on going back, looking at that reentry plan, because when we adopted it back in June and July, it was really a theory. And now that we've been in this practice and we see what the indicators are moving forward, we've got to be more creative. The tutor.com was a great example of what something we can bring to where we're just not trying to continue to wring that every drop out of that washcloth, that we've traditionally done. We've tried to do the same things and do them faster and harder. And so your questions tonight are really intuitive about how do we do things differently, right? And so credit to Ms. Beltran and the HR team for the partnerships that we created with Cal Poly, and that was with in conjunction with instructional services to build that residency program. There's some exciting things in the offing. The stark reality is we are where we are right now in this COVID world, right? And we just got to stay the course, hang on. For any of our community members, in our school community that's out there, again, just want to commend folks for their resolve. Our families, our staff members, and most importantly, our kids. I mean, this is, we're doing the best we can. Hoping that, knowing that we will come through this stronger together. And so I want to thank the board, and again, welcome Mr. Valencia. I look forward to having you here officially next week. And that's all I got.
No, and I apologize. I didn't say anything before, but when you're speaking about thanking everybody, I have, again, I said last thing, good, even in the face of that, good things are happening, right? I think our teachers are our main innovators, and I think that's also one of the things that came out in a lot of the courses that we took in and about changing, using this opportunity to see this as not a one-room schoolhouse and traditional focus or way to educate. But it's interesting. I was speaking with one of the PE teachers who was just really just blown away by his students, right? Really, I mean, just the engagement, and then what he was really pleased with was that, you know, there's a certain element of exposure you have to undergo in a PE class, right? And for some people, some kids it's more comfortable than others, and so some of the kids that he's had year over year and been able to see now in this setting have, because they're at home and they're on their, I mean, it's really kind of emblematic of what's going on, right? Is these kids are blossoming in PE class because they're at home on their own, and they're showing far less inhibition, and they're really into their lessons. And so he was just blown away by that and loving it. So there are those little pearls that we need to kind of really also keep focusing on to keep us inspired, and our kids will do it. The kids will inspire us, that's for sure, and they'll inspire their parents and they'll inspire the teachers. So I thank you for mentioning that, because I did promise him I did ask him if I could mention that. So it was Mike Pope, by the way.
Oh, outstanding.
That if that's it, that's it. We'll close